What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Primary Source Walkthroughs. Uh, we're back after a little bit of a hiatus, but we are back, and we're going to be pushing forward and jumping right into the middle of the 19th century. So, what we have this week is we have really a two-parter. Both sources that we're going to talk about uh, have to do with the defense of the institution of slavery in the United States from two different people. So in this video, what we're going to discuss is we're going to discuss J.H. Hammond, a senator from South Carolina, and he's before that he's in the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, where he gives this speech, he is defending the institution of slavery. It should be no surprise that he is coming from South Carolina. South Carolina is the state that produces probably the most ardent defense of the institution of slavery. Hammond's not the only one who will do something like this. You have John C. Calhoun, who says that slavery is a positive good on the floor of the United States Senate. It's Andrew Butler, whose honor is questioned by Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, when Charles Sumner gives a speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," and calls Andrew Butler a prostitute for the whore of slavery. It's South Carolina, and then Charles Sumner gets beaten on the floor of the Senate. So to say that that South Carolina and slavery go together is no mistake. And like I said, it's South Carolina that is the first state to secede from the United States and form the Confederacy. So Hammond is going to give his defense of slavery, and he's going to decry the abolition movement in this speech as well. One thing to say about the abolition movement in the United States at this time, despite what Southerners say, it is not a very widespread and popular movement. In fact, abolition, especially in the 1830s, 1840s, is probably the least popular movement in the United States. Not nobody, but a lot of people just don't care. Most whites, if they were against slavery, they were free soilers, and they didn't care about equal rights for blacks. They just wanted labor opportunities for whites. They just didn't want slavery to expand. We're not talking. More people were concerned about the amount of alcohol that Americans were drinking than the amount of slaves that Southerners owned. Regardless, the South perceives any talk about slavery or abolishing slavery as suspect. And in fact, it's the South that's going to make talking poorly about slavery illegal in public. They don't allow anti-slavery literature to be passed down. Anyone who's writing abolitionist literature in the North, the South wants to kill, quite literally. They hatch kidnapping plots and all sorts of stuff in order to protect the institution of slavery. So just keep all of that in mind. Now let's jump into the source. What Hammond is going to do is he is going to call out the abolition movement, and he is going to say, here's what they want. And that's what this first, second, and third is. They want the abolition of slavery completely. They want the slave trade to stop, and they want equal rights for blacks. The third bit, almost nobody was arguing for at the time. That would have been very, very unpopular. Certainly, some abolitionists were. William Lloyd Garrison gets there eventually. Of course, Frederick Douglass is demanding those things. But by and large, most of the abolitionist movement was not arguing for equal rights. They just wanted slavery gone. So we already can tell that Hammond is exaggerating a bit. And he says, okay, well, there are three ways that the abolitionist movement can try to convince the South that slavery is not good. They can try to convince the slaveholders, they can try to convince the government, or they can try to convince slaves themselves, and maybe start a insurrection or revolt. And so Hammond says, well, look, if you try to go with the slaveholders, it's just not going to work. We already know that even those weird people, as he kind of puts it, who free their slaves, don't really free their slaves. They sell their slaves first, and then they support abolitionist causes. I don't think that's true. He doesn't give us any evidence for that. So, like, if they're trying to make freeing slaves appealing, that's not going to work, is what he's saying. So the only thing that the abolitionist has in his arsenal, or her arsenal, is to appeal to slaves, or to the fear of a slave revolt. And that's what he's talking about here when he says servile insurrection. That's what that means. So he says, look, like, you're just not going to convince slaves to revolt. They don't revolt. And that's not entirely true. He says that there's only been one serious one. He doesn't say which one. But let's keep in mind that the Haitian Revolution not only eliminated slavery in Haiti, but overthrew the French government there, and declared independence from France. Like, that's a pretty big deal. Plus, there are other smaller successful slave revolts too. I would say Nat Turner's revolt is successful. It doesn't free all of the slaves, but certainly puts the fear in the heart of the slaveholder. So, your mileage may vary. The other thing that Hammond says is, like, look, slaves don't riot, only free men do. And he makes some reference to some of the stuff that's going on in the North, with labor unrest and that sort of thing. We kind of saw when we were talking about industrialization. And this is a tried and true method of Southerners to point to the system of labor in the North and say, you talk all of this stuff about slavery, but look up in the North. You have people who are striking, you have riots, you have violence and all of that sort of stuff. People are setting things on fire. We don't have that in the South. Now, you might be thinking, and you'd be right to think this, well, of course they don't have that in the South, because if somebody steps out of line and they're a slave, they die. Or they are beaten within an inch of their life. And we have all of the evidence in the world to say that that is absolutely the case. That the threat of violence, the sheer terrorism of slavery was enough to keep a lot of slaves in line. So, Hammond's not seeing things clearly here. He's going to say that slavery is just great for the slave, and that it makes things great for slaves. Like, slavery is comfortable, and no slave would ever want to escape, or blah blah blah. We know that's not true. It's just that's what he's saying to try to prove his argument. He's also talking a bit here about slavery in terms of where it's being abolished, and only where it is unprofitable, he says, has it been abolished. And he says that, look, if we have a need for agriculture, we have a need for slavery. That's one of his main arguments here. Which I don't, that's what he certainly thinks. But I don't think that that is true. I will leave it to you, though, to go and think about that. Is slavery in the 19th century necessary for agriculture? I would say look around the world and no. But this is what he says. By the time we're in the middle of 1836, slavery in the Western world is pretty much gone and everyone's still alive. But, he's a Southern. This is what they're arguing. All right. He also says, look, we have recognized that slavery is just a part of natural law. That God has made slavery to fulfill the needs of agricultural people. And he continues the argument and says, well, look, if we had a strike in agriculture, the society would die because nobody would eat. I struggle to see the merit in the argument here, because the people who are enslaving slaves, why can't they go out and farm their own food? But he's saying, look, we have to have this kind of labor because if we don't, then society is going to collapse. He continues on and he says that slavery is a blessing from God. He says, first, some people say that slavery is evil, and his argument against this is twofold. He says, first, number one, if it is evil, it's our evil, and we're dealing with it, so you don't have to worry about it. Nobody should comment. But then he says, slavery isn't evil, it's in fact a blessing from God. And that it's just the natural order of things. So he says you could try to appeal to the slaves themselves, but like we mentioned before, Hammond believes that slavery is good for the slave. He says, I say it boldly, there is not a happier, more contented race upon the face of the earth. I have been born and brought up in the midst of them, the slaves, and so far as my knowledge and experience extend, I should say that they have every reason to be happy. Lightly tasked, well-clothed, well-fed, far better than the free laborers of any country in the world, our own, and perhaps those of the other states of this confederacy alone excepted. Their lives and persons protected by the law, all their suffering alleviated by the kindest and most interested care, and their domestic affections cherished and maintained, at least so far as I is known, with conscientious delicacy. Wow. You've seen the back of a slave before. You know how they were whipped. You know how they were hunted. You know how they were physically abused, starved, raped. All of that violence. And Hammond says, well, none of that's true because I've never seen it. He's a liar. I bet he saw it. He's also going to say that this is just the natural condition of the African race. And he makes a weird reference here. So he says that this is the doom of Ham. This has nothing to do with a pork product. Okay, this is not ham like you put on a sandwich. Ham here refers to one of the sons of Noah. This is a biblical reference. So if you look at Genesis 9:20 through 27, you'll find the story of Ham, one of Noah's sons, doing something that gets him in a bit of trouble, and he's cast out, and this sets up a difference between the Israelites and the Canaanites, and there's a whole bunch of Bible stuff there that maybe that makes sense to you, maybe it doesn't. Basically, if you read the story literally, Noah got really drunk and was really naked, and Ham saw his drunk, naked father kind of rolling in the dirt, being wasted off his ass, and laughed at him. Now, others have said that it was not necessarily that Ham saw him drunk and naked. It was that Ham told everybody about it. Some say that if you read the Hebrew and know the implications of the Hebrew words used, that Ham may have either castrated or sodomized his father, Noah, and that's the punishment for that's the crime that deserves such a harsh punishment. You can look into that if you want to. I just wanted to point out that weird reference because it probably made no sense to you. But anyway, when somebody says the doom of Ham, they're referring to that story, but they're also saying that this is how we explain how Africans are slaves. That's what their argument is. It's a piss poor one if you ask me. So anyway, the rest, he goes on, and he starts talking about kind of property and that sort of stuff. But I wanted to point out this little bit here at the end, where he's claiming that slavery creates an aristocracy. And he means it in the kind of rich man way, but he's also saying that slavery immediately elevates every white person above every black person. That slavery creates this environment where, you know, a white person, because he cannot be a slave, he has to be a free man, is an aristocrat because he has all of this freedom that is created by the existence of slavery. So he concludes by saying, I do firmly believe that domestic slavery, regulated as ours is, produces the highest toned, the purest, best organization society that has ever existed on the face of the earth. And if you look closely, I had to write pukes because that's just gross. So that's the basic outline of a defense of slavery, that it elevates whites over blacks, and this is a good thing, that it's good for the slave, that it's absolutely necessary for society, that it creates structure and order, and all those sorts of things. So that's something that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about, you know, how could Southerners defend this awful institution. This primary source shows you exactly how they did it. So, we're going to look at another one in a second video here in just a bit, but that is the basic gist of J.H. Hammond's defense of slavery. If you have any questions about Hammond's source here, his speech, feel free to reach out to me via email or in an office hour, and I'll see you on the next one.